Thomas pressed his back against the cabin wall, his heart hammering as his father's voice cut through the mountain air outside. "I know you're hiding something, son." Sheriff Morrison's boots creaked on the wooden porch, just feet from where Celeste crouched in the shadows, clutching the blood-stained letter that could destroy everything his father had built, or finally reveal the truth about hers. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall of Hartwell Bank, my 17-year-old heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst right through my chest. The gunshots exploded around me like thunder in a bottle, each one making me flinch deeper into the shadows. My name is Celeste Morrison, and watching my father die wasn't supposed to be part of the plan today. Blackjack Morrison had dragged me into this life, kicking and screaming. Well, maybe not literally kicking and screaming, but I never wanted to be an outlaw's daughter. Makes sense, right? Most girls my age were worried about which dress to wear to church socials. I was learning how to load a pistol and keep watch for lawmen. But here's the weird part. My father wasn't even here to steal money. I watched in horror as he stumbled out of Banker Whitmore's private office, clutching a leather satchel against his chest like it contained the secrets of the universe. Blood was already seeping through his shirt from where Sheriff Harrison's first shot had caught him in the shoulder. The look on his face wasn't the usual cocky grin he wore during our other jobs. This was different, desperate. "You don't understand what you're protecting, Harrison," my father shouted across the dusty street, his voice cracking with pain and something that sounded almost like pleading. Sheriff Harrison stood 20 paces away, his smoking revolver steady in his grip. "I understand plenty, Jack. You're a thief and a killer, and your reign of terror ends today." The second shot rang out before my father could say another word. I bit down on my knuckles so hard I tasted blood, fighting back the scream that wanted to tear from my throat. Blackjack Morrison crumpled to the ground like a marionette with cut strings, the satchel spilling from his lifeless fingers. The man who had raised me, taught me to ride and shoot and survive in this harsh mountain country, was gone in an instant. Then there was the matter of staying alive myself. The townspeople were already gathering, their voices rising in that peculiar mixture of excitement and fear that comes after violence. Someone would remember seeing me around town. Someone would put two and two together. The Morrison name carried a bounty heavy enough to feed a family for months, and I had no illusions about frontier loyalty when money was involved. I grabbed the satchel and ran. The wilderness swallowed me whole within minutes, but the mountains that had always felt like home suddenly turned hostile. 3 days of stumbling through pine forests and rocky ravines, with nothing but creek water and a few strips of jerky, had reduced me to something barely human. My lips were cracked, my hands shaking from cold and hunger. The wanted posters I'd glimpsed being nailed to trees showed my face above the words, "Dead or alive, 500 reward." $500. That's what my life was worth to them. The frozen river was where my strength finally gave out. I collapsed beside the ice-covered water, my father's satchel clutched against my chest, wondering if this was how the Morrison legacy would end. Not in a blaze of gunfire, but with a 17-year-old girl freezing to death beside a stream that probably didn't even have a name. That's when I heard the footsteps crunching through the snow behind me. I tried to turn, tried to reach for the pistol tucked in my belt, but my fingers wouldn't cooperate. A shadow fell across my vision, and I found myself staring up at a young man about my own age. Sandy brown hair, concerned blue eyes, and a star-shaped deputy's badge glinting on his coat. Well, I thought grimly, at least I wouldn't have to wonder about freezing to death anymore. But why wasn't he reaching for his gun? "Thomas Harrison," he said quietly, like he was introducing himself at a church social instead of arresting a wanted outlaw. "And you're bleeding." I blinked up at him, wondering if the cold had finally scrambled my brains. This boy, and he was clearly just a boy despite that deputy's badge, was crouched down beside me with genuine concern written across his face. His coat was already off his shoulders before I could form a coherent thought. "You're Celeste Morrison," he continued, wrapping the warm wool around my shivering frame. "Half the territory's looking for you. Then why aren't you shooting me?" The words came out as barely a whisper, my voice cracked from thirst and exhaustion. Thomas glanced around the empty forest, then back at my face. "Because you look like you're already dying, and my father raised me better than to kick a person when they're down." He paused, studying my features with those honest blue eyes. "Even if that person supposedly killed 3 men in Hartwell. I never killed anyone." The protest slipped out before I could stop it. Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of doubt that told me maybe this sheriff's son wasn't as convinced of my guilt as the rest of the territory. He slipped one arm under my shoulders, supporting my weight as he helped me to my feet. "There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile from here," Thomas said, shouldering my father's satchel without even asking. "My grandfather used to hunt these mountains. Nobody's been there in years." I should have been suspicious, should have wondered why the son of the man who killed my father would risk his reputation to help me. But when you're half dead from exposure and someone offers you shelter, you don't spend too much time questioning their motives. The cabin was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned trapper's shelter. One room, stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture that had seen better decades. But it had 4 walls and a roof, which made it feel like a palace after 3 nights sleeping under pine trees. Thomas got a fire going while I collapsed onto an old cot in the corner. My whole body felt like it was made of lead and broken glass. The warmth from the flames started bringing feeling back to my fingers, which meant the pain wasn't far behind. "Why are you doing this?" I asked as he handed me a tin cup filled with water from his canteen. He settled onto a 3-legged stool near the fire, turning his hat over in his hands. "My father always taught me that justice and law aren't always the same thing." Thomas looked up at me then, and I caught something complicated in his expression. "Maybe I want to hear your side before I decide which one applies here." Over the next few days, Thomas proved himself to be either the most decent person I'd ever met or the most elaborate trap ever set. He brought food from town, jerky, hardtack, even some of his mother's preserved apples. He cleaned and bandaged the cuts on my hands where I'd scraped them raw climbing over rocks. Most importantly, he kept the search parties away from our little sanctuary. "They're getting more desperate," he told me on the 4th day, settling down beside the fire after another trip to town. "Banker Whitmore is offering an extra $100 for information leading to your capture. 600 total now?" I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out bitter. My father would be proud. He always said I'd be worth something someday. Thomas studied my face in the firelight. "You don't sound like you appreciated the career path he chose for you." That's when the whole story started spilling out. How Blackjack had dragged me from town to town since I was 12. How I'd begged him to settle down, find honest work, give us both a chance at a normal life. How every job was supposed to be just one more, then we'll have enough to disappear. "But the bank job wasn't about money," I said finally, my fingers tracing the edge of my father's leather satchel. "He kept saying he'd found something important, something that would change everything." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the worn leather bag. "What kind of something?" I'd been wrestling with this decision for days now. Could I trust this sheriff's son with whatever secret had gotten my father killed? Could I trust him with anything at all? But looking at his face in that moment, open, honest, genuinely concerned about the truth, I made my choice. The satchel's contents scattered across the cabin floor like pieces of a puzzle I'd never seen before. Bank documents, deeds, correspondence between Banker Whitmore and various officials. Pages and pages of careful records in my father's distinctive handwriting. Thomas picked up one of the land deeds, his brow furrowing as he read. "This is the Henderson farm, but they lost this place 2 years ago when they couldn't make their loan payments." "Look at the date on that deed," I said quietly. He studied the paper more closely, and I watched his face change as the implications sank in. "This is dated 3 months after they supposedly defaulted. Whitmore sold their land before they even missed a payment." We spent the next hour going through document after document. The pattern was always the same. Whitmore would manipulate loan terms, forge signatures, or simply fabricate defaults to steal properties from settlers who thought they were buying legitimate homesteads. Then he'd sell the same land multiple times over, pocketing the profits while families lost everything they'd worked for. "My father wasn't robbing that bank," I said, as Thomas stared at a letter detailing bribes paid to various territorial officials. "He was trying to expose this whole operation." Thomas held up another document, his face pale in the firelight. "Celeste. This one has my family's name on it." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Our original homestead, the one we supposedly lost in a card game before I was born." The weight of what we'd discovered settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. My father hadn't been the villain in this story. He'd been trying to right wrongs that went deeper than anyone imagined, and Thomas was learning that his own family had been victims of the same corruption that had destroyed so many others. "Your father killed a man who was trying to help people," I said gently. Thomas stared into the fire for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a pain I recognized all too well. "Then that makes him as much a victim as anyone else, doesn't it?" Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the cabin's old windows. But inside our small circle of firelight, everything had changed. We weren't just outlaw and lawman's son anymore. We were two people who discovered that the world was far more complicated than either of us had ever imagined. Thomas looked up at me, decision crystallizing in his blue eyes. "We have to get this evidence to someone who can do something about it. That means walking back into a town full of people who want me dead." He nodded grimly. "The circuit judge arrives next week for monthly court sessions. If we can get these documents to him..." Thomas trailed off, but I could see him working through the possibilities and dangers in his mind. What he couldn't see yet was his father's shadow moving past our window, drawn by reports of suspicious activity in these abandoned woods. I watched my father's shadow freeze against the cabin wall, knowing we had maybe seconds before everything fell apart. Thomas was already moving, shoving the scattered documents back into the satchel with practiced efficiency. His hands weren't shaking, which impressed me more than it probably should have. "Back corner," he whispered, pointing toward the darkest section of the one-room cabin. "Stay low." Sheriff Harrison's boots stopped creaking on the porch. The silence stretched out like a held breath. Then his voice cut through the mountain air, steady and suspicious. "Thomas, I know you're in there, son." My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed myself into the shadows. The blood-stained documents felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds in my arms. Everything his father had built his reputation on was about to crumble, and somehow that felt worse than my own danger. Thomas opened the door like he didn't have a care in the world. "Evening, Pa. What brings you out here?" "Reports of someone using this old place." Sheriff Harrison stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room methodically. The dying fire cast strange shadows across his weathered face. "Figured I'd better check it out myself." "Just me," Thomas said, settling onto that three-legged stool like he'd been sitting there all evening. "Needed some time to think." His father's gaze lingered on the 2 tin cups beside the fire. Thomas had forgotten about those. "Mighty thirsty thinking you've been doing." The silence stretched between father and son while I held my breath in the corner. Sheriff Harrison had killed my father 4 days ago. Right now, he was standing close enough that I could have reached out and touched his gun belt. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Something's been eating at you lately," Sheriff Harrison continued, his voice softer now, concerned. "Your mother's worried. You've been disappearing for hours, coming home with that look on your face like the world's gone sideways." Thomas stared into the fire. "Maybe it has gone sideways, Pa." "How do you mean?" "What if we've been wrong about something important? What if the people we thought were heroes turned out to be villains, and the villains turned out to be heroes?" Sheriff Harrison's hand drifted toward his holster, and I realized he was starting to put pieces together. "You wouldn't be talking about Blackjack Morrison, would you?" That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I stepped out of the shadows, my father's satchel clutched against my chest. "He's talking about the truth, Sheriff. Something you might want to hear before you decide whether to shoot me." Both men spun toward my voice. Thomas looked like he might faint. His father's gun was in his hand before I'd finished speaking. "Celeste Morrison." Sheriff Harrison's voice was flat, professional. "You're under arrest for robbery and murder." "I never killed anyone." The same words I'd told his son days earlier. "But I can prove my father died trying to save this town from the real criminals." Thomas stood up slowly, positioning himself between his father's gun and my body. "Pa, you need to see what's in that satchel. Step aside, son. Not until you look at the evidence." The three of us stood there in a triangle of tension, firelight dancing across our faces. Sheriff Harrison's finger was on the trigger, but something in Thomas's voice made him hesitate. "Your boy's got more integrity than most grown men," I said quietly. "Maybe he gets that from you." Sheriff Harrison's eyes flicked between his son and me. "What kind of evidence?" I opened the satchel slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The documents spilled across the cabin floor again, this time under the scrutiny of the man who'd killed my father to protect them. Banker Whitmore's been stealing land and money from half the families in this territory, I said, as Sheriff Harrison knelt to examine the papers. My father found out. That's why he was really in that bank. Thomas picked up the deed with his family's name on it. Pa, remember the story you told me about losing our first homestead in a card game? His father's face went white as he read the document. There was no card game, Thomas continued. Whitmore stole it the same way he stole everyone else's land. Sheriff Harrison sank onto the remaining chair, suddenly looking older than his years. The gun hung loose in his grip, forgotten. Sweet Jesus, what have I done? Then there was the matter of staying alive long enough to make this right. The gunshot that saved my life came from Sheriff Harrison's own pistol. Banker Whitmore's hired gun dropped like a stone just outside the cabin window, his rifle clattering against the porch boards. Apparently, greed makes people impatient. Whitmore couldn't wait for the law to handle me quietly. Well, Sheriff Harrison said, holstering his weapon with steady hands. Guess that answers any questions about whose side I'm on now. Thomas was already moving, gathering the scattered documents while keeping one eye on the tree line. There might be more coming. There are. His father checked his ammunition with the casual efficiency of a man who'd been wearing a badge for 20 years. Whitmore's got 3 men in town who'd sell their mothers for drinking money. I clutched the satchel tighter. So what's the plan? Hide in this cabin forever? Sheriff Harrison looked at me directly for the first time since learning the truth. The circuit judge arrives tomorrow morning. We get you and those documents to the courthouse alive, and Whitmore's finished. And if we don't make it? Thomas grinned, and for a moment I saw exactly where he got his stubborn streak. Then at least we'll go down swinging for the right side this time. The ride into town felt like the longest mile of my life. Sheriff Harrison led the way, his son and the outlaw's daughter flanking him like some kind of twisted family portrait. People stared from doorways and windows, whispering behind their hands. The Morrison girl, riding bold as brass down Main Street with the law. Judge Crawford was a thin man with intelligent eyes who listened without interrupting while we laid out every document, every forged deed, every stolen dollar. Whitmore showed up halfway through our presentation, demanding to know why a known criminal was being allowed to spread lies in his courtroom. These aren't lies, Judge Crawford said quietly, holding up a bank transfer order in Whitmore's own handwriting. These are evidence. The trial lasted 3 days. By the end, half the town had their land restored and their money returned. The other half learned that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones robbing you blind. Sheriff Harrison kept his badge, but carried it different now. Heavier, maybe. Like he understood the weight of the decisions that came with it. Thomas and I, we're still figuring that part out. Turns out building something honest takes longer than tearing down lies. But we've got time now. Time and truth and the knowledge that sometimes the best thing you can do is trust someone who's got every reason not to trust you back. My father's buried in the town cemetery now, with a proper headstone that calls him James Morrison instead of Black Jack. Hero seemed too simple, but James Morrison, who died trying to do right, that fits just fine.